Behind one of these doors is an extraordinary house with one of the most important interiors of the entire 20th century. It's the work of an internationally famous architect, and his client was a Northampton model maker. Welcome to number 78 Derngate here in Northampton. Now, I'm in this remarkable interior designed by Charles Rennie Mackintosh, the celebrated Scottish architect. And I can tell you that this was his only commission outside his native Scotland, and actually his last major commission before he died. Well, my first visit to this house was in 2003 when I came along to see how the restoration work was taking place. 5 years later, I came along to the grand opening where I was able to see the museum and the galleries. Well, today I'm back to see how things have progressed and then to tell you a little bit more about the fascinating story of this jewel of a house. In 1998, a trust was formed to preserve and look after 78 Derngate. With the generosity of the first chairman's family, local councils and people of the county, a successful heritage lottery application was made to restore the property. In 1916, Mackintosh was asked to remodel a Georgian terraced house, but the dramatic style of the interior was a complete departure from his earlier work. The house is of the highest cultural and architectural importance, and now, around 100 years since it was redesigned, the fixtures and fittings of number 78 Derngate have been restored to their original Mackintosh design condition. John McCaslin architects were engaged, and with a team of expert conservators, researchers and builders, they painstakingly recreated the house of 1916. 78 Derngate had been used for various activities during the intervening period: domestic dwelling, offices, and then part of a high school for girls. Luckily, much of the interior had been untouched, except for being painted or wallpapered over. Well, this is the hall lounge, and Mackintosh himself described the decor in here as being mysterious. Well, in many respects, what we're looking at is an interior of 1916, which preempts what was to follow in around about 1925 in the age of Art Deco. Art Deco is a term that we use today that wasn't used back then. Back then, everything was either modern or jazz. And it's fair to say that the frieze that you see behind me is somewhat jazzy. What is interesting is that Mackintosh has attempted to make this room even bigger by taking the staircase and putting it from left to right across the building, and then opening up the screen to give a sense of depth. So the overall effect of this room is one of, believe it or not, spaciousness, which is made all the more remarkable by his use of this black screen, which, if you're looking for an influence there, look no further than Japan. This iconic house was the first home of the newlywed Mr. and Mrs. Bassett Loke. In 1916, he had become a successful businessman, employing over 500 people in his town centre factory, making working model trains and boats. The Georgian house was a wedding present from his father, which Bassett Loke set out to transform into a modern, convenient home. Bassett Loke promoted good design not only in industry, but also at the domestic level. He had trained as an architect and was well travelled throughout Europe, which is reflected in his choice and certainly influenced the final product here at 78 Derngate. Well, in the hall lounge, Mackintosh was given carte blanche, and he certainly went to town. But when you make an entrance into the dining room, you can see that you're dealing with a complete contrast of style, because you're dealing with a contrast of ideals. This is the sort of interior that Mr. and Mrs. Wenman Bassett Loke felt more at home with. And in all fairness, it's got something of a very chintzy, Englishy feel to it. The table is actually designed by Bassett Loke himself, but it's based on a Mackintosh original. The fitted furniture is Mackintosh. And when you look at something like this, you'd be thinking you're dealing with 1930, 1935. But remember, we are dealing with 1916. Just a nice little feature and that is these hinged lanterns, just for ease of access for changing those light bulbs. The wood itself is figured walnut, so it gives an expensive feel to the room, and the actual drawers are fitted, and they are quite austere. And I can tell you that I think, in all fairness, bearing in mind that Charles René Mackintosh never ever visited 78 Derngate, believe it or not, I think if he was to walk into this room, he would experience an emotion called consternation. 78 Derngate is very different from Mackintosh's earlier style. When you think Mackintosh, you tend to think of crisp white rooms. He was famous for his masterful handling of light and space, and his designs wouldn't look out of place in the modern minimalist interiors magazine, quite unlike the totally cluttered Victorian look at this time. His furniture and interior detailing were full of sinuous Art Nouveau curves and favourite motifs like the stylised pink rose. Many of his pieces have become icons of design, and you can see all this in his work that he did in Scotland. At number 78, however, Mackintosh's interior scheme is black and geometric, and luckily, much of the interior features have survived. Now, the Bassett Lokes perceive themselves as modern folk in every sense of the term. In fact, Bassett Loke himself is said to have uttered that you shouldn't have anything in your home that might be older than you are. And in all fairness, I've seen contemporary photographs of this kitchen in 1916, and this area here is smothered with an array of electrical and gas appliances, the purpose of which just defied description. But what is interesting is that they also had, as a concession, if you will, to the past, an entire range in the fireplace. This fireplace was put in the 1930s. So during the winter, most of the cooking would have been done on a traditional range, but come summer, all the electrical appliances that we see here would have been put to good use. It's interesting to think that you could have, in 1916 or thereabouts, an electric kettle. Some things go back an awful lot farther than we give them credit. But as for the kitchen itself today, it's practical. The actual fitted cabinets, the colour and everything has been determined from paint scrapes, and we are really in something of a time warp. And despite all the gadgetry that was in here, at the end of the day, this is a room that begs you to almost get baking. Well, as we've made our way up the stairs, we've followed that sort of Japanese screen design up on all levels. As we make our way here into the guest bedroom, we are greeted once again, as we were in the hall lounge, with something that you might describe as a wow factor. But here is a room which is based entirely on severe symmetry. There's a jewel-like quality in the lampshades, which are true reproductions of what would have been here in 1916. There's a hint of the Orient about them. But when it comes to the fabrics that have been used here, they are, to say the least, exotic. The boards, the headboards, the footboards of the beds, quite simplistic. Decoration is limited to a painted sort of key design, which is echoed also in those remarkable little chairs at the head of the footboard. So it begs the question, while a guest was lying in bed, whether or not this design was placed there to prompt him to make an early exit, because I can tell you now, just gazing up at this amazing fabric, and it is fabric, by the way, it fuddles the brain. So I think it's fair to say that if you were a guest of the Bassett Lokes, you would be at breakfast early. Next door, number 80 Derngate has been completely gutted, and all the floors, the roof and even the bay window has been demolished to make way for an ultra-modern museum. Here you'll see artefacts on display to help interpret the house telling the story of Mackintosh and his patron, W.J. Bassett Loke. In 1926, the Bassett-Lokes achieved their dream of having a purpose-built house designed for them by Peter Behrens, and they moved away from 78 and into New Ways, the first modernist home in the UK. Bassett-Loke continued his successful company, playing an important role in the Second World War as he had done in the First, making working models of the temporary harbours for the Normandy landings. By 1923, the Macintoshes had moved to Port Vendres, a coastal town in southern France. Macintosh had entirely abandoned architecture and design and concentrated on watercolour painting. He was interested in the relationship between man-made and naturally occurring landscapes, and created a large portfolio of architecture and landscape watercolour paintings. Many of his paintings depict Port Vendres. The couple remained in France for 2 years before being forced, due to his illness, to return to London in 1927, where he died the following year. Well, I hope you enjoy your visit to number 78 Derngate, and don't forget to drop by our shop, our restaurant and our galleries, and if you want any more information, you'll find it all on the website. Now, bearing in mind that the Bassett-Lokes could throw a good party, it's worth also pointing out that number 78 is open for hire for your event.